Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. Today I'll be continuing on with Yuuei Survival Guide. This will be Part 6, Chapter 6. Shota rouses from his hazy, dreamless sleep to an annoying beeping. He keeps his eyes shut, head lolling in the direction the noise is coming from. He has hopes of going back to sleep, like he usually does, praying Hizashi will turn the annoying alarm off, but he doesn't. He still feels hazy, like his brain isn't completely functioning. The tired man lulls his head back so he's staring up at the ceiling before prying his eyes open. They burn, like he'd gone too far, way too long, without resting his quirk. His eyelids grate against his dry eyes like sandpaper. But what's most surprising is the fact that his eyes are open, but he's still in the dark. Well, not quite in the dark. He can see lights faintly bleeding in, but his vision is white, like there's something covering his eyes. And it's not just his eyes, but his whole face. If he wasn't so tired, he's sure he'd be panicking, but for now it's what it is. He tries in vain to reach up and pull whatever it is on his face off, only to frown drowsily when his arms refuse to move. Neither budge, no matter how hard he focuses, or how much of his strength and energy he forces into lifting them up. They're heavy and numb. They might even be an inkling of pain hidden in there as well, but it's overwhelmed by a floaty feeling. It takes far longer than Shota would like to admit for him to lay out all the information he'd gathered thus far, trying to make sense of it all. The answer hits him like a brick. He was in the hospital. The beeping wasn't a stupid, insistent alarm that Hizashi forgot to turn off before getting up. It was a heart monitor, steadily beeping on. The covering on his face, he assumes, at least, is a bandage of sort, and his arms refusing to move, in addition to the strange, numb, floaty feeling, must mean he'd been injured pretty badly. Now that he thinks about it, it's all there. The sterile scent, the blinding white lights, the rough blankets on the bed, and the pillows drawing a fine line between cardboard textured and uncomfortably overstuffed. The smell he now notices is that of medical gauze and cotton bandages wrapped around his face. He's not a stranger to hospitals, no pro-hero is, but it has been a while since he's been this beat up. It takes a few more contemplative moments for him to remember exactly how he'd ended up here. And if the knowledge that he was in the hospital at all hit him like a brick, then reason as to why he's here plows into him like a freight truck. The USJ. The villain attack. His students, oh God, his students. It all floods back like a tsunami washing over him, leaving his students in the capable hands of 13, rushing the crowd of villains in an attempt to keep them away from his kids. He remembers the leader, villain, the one who had the powerful, was it a decaying quirk, that he'd used on Shota's elbow, and the one with the warp quirk standing loyally at his leader's side, and that creature, the one with the insane strength, whatever that thing was. He remembers being tossed around like a weightless doll, and having his head ground into the concrete, the explanation for the bandages on his face. He remembers the pain of his arms snapping under the creature's slow, steady movements. How so little effort from it had sent him into screaming out agony. The pain of his face grinding against the splintered concrete, and the metallic taste of his own blood as it pools in his mouth, and as it runs down his face only to catch on his lips. He has half a mind to lick at his lips now, hazy brain supplying phantom feelings of blood cascading down his face, but he thinks better of it when the cotton bandages wrapped so snugly. The last thing he needs right now is to choke on cotton specks. Shota forces his attention back to what he remembers of the villain attack, being stomped down whenever he tried to fight back, or even so much as move. The thought of it makes pain flare throughout his body, but it's swiftly washed away by whatever painkiller they have him on. They're strong, thankfully. Everything gets a bit hazier after that. He remembers seeing Midoriya, Tsuyu, and Minoru in the water by where he and the villains had been fighting. A huff of frustration struggles out of his lungs. That problem child no doubt brought the other two students along with him. He had told them to stay away, to stay with 13, but he's honestly not surprised. He briefly wonders how much his kids saw, eyes fluttering shut as he realized they'd probably seen a lot. His eyelids jolt open when the next piece of the attacks clears in his mind. The decaying, quirked villain had been running at his kids. He'd tried to turn his students into dust. Were they okay? Had he managed to stop the quirk in time? Had he gotten to Tsuyu before he could erase his quirk? It's staticky, but he thinks he had managed to activate his quirk in time. He faintly remembers the villain talking to him. A sick mixture of impressed and annoyed, but after that it gets a bit fuzzy again. He wonders if it was because he was drifting between consciousness and unconsciousness, but he can't be sure. Maybe he'd just been blacking out or simply didn't remember the exchange. He tries to remember what else happens before he ultimately loses his consciousness battle. He racks his brain for anything of importance in those final moments of awareness. His brain comes to an abrupt halt. Oboro. He'd seen Oboro. Oboro with Midoriya. His friend who'd died at the young age of 17, 13 years ago, and had been standing beside his current student. Logically, he knows he couldn't have been there. Even in his hazy memories, he remembers the translucentness of the boy who'd been one of his best friends throughout school. He's trying hard to come up with a logical excuse for it. Oboro was dead. There was no way he could have been there. There was no way. It was illogical. Dead people don't come back. When you die, you die. So how had he seen his school friend? Shota's about to let the whole thing go. He'd been hanging by an inch of his own life. He'd been so close to death, seconds away from passing out from a cocktail of pain and exhaustion. There's no way he'd really seen Oboro. It was just his brain playing tricks on him, a ghost from the past. Someone he hadn't been able to save. There to stir up all the guilt that he'd been walling off for years. It was silly. A ghost. He'd seen the ghost of his dead friend, looking exactly as Shota remembers him, or chooses to remember him at least. The Oboro that he struggles to remember when he thinks of his friend. The smiling, exuberant Oboro he'd seen every day at school, as opposed to the Oboro he'd seen that last day after. Shota swallows hard, mouth dry. Ghosts didn't exist. It was illogical. He'd just been seeing things. It was impossible. But that didn't explain the clouds. His traitorous brain reminded him in a whisper, in the back of his mind. The clouds. Oh God, there had been clouds. Clouds like that were not easily brushed off as easily as a potential ghost. Clouds don't just appear, and certainly not in a contained space like the USJ. Not even to mention the fact that those clouds were so real, nothing man-made could have created them. He'd been pretty out of it at that point, but he remembers the clouds. He remembers feeling them envelop him, and just like they'd used to during his school days when Oboro used to practice different cloud types and consistencies, often using himself and Hizashi as test subjects when it came to density control and strength for escorting people around other than himself. He remembers the softness in Oboro's care when handling them, the density that had filled in around him at the blink of an eye. Someone, or something, had used the quirk cloud. And the only person to ever have such a quirk, as far as Shota knows, with as much pointed precision and control over it like he'd seen at the USJ before passing out, had died years ago, taking that incredible quirk along with one of the kindest people Shota had ever known. Shota. Shota jumps at the call of the soft voice. The bed shifts a little, and it's just then that Shota realizes someone, Hizashi, his brain adds, must have been sleeping on the edge of his mattress. Sweetheart, are you awake and panicking? Do I need to call for a nurse? It's only after the startled, tired words from his husband that Shota realizes his heart monitor is beeping wildly in warning, and he can feel his heart thumping anxiously in his chest. He can almost picture Hizashi's worried expression at being startled, awake by it, bottom lip caught between his teeth, being worried nervously as a small frown tugs at the corner of his lips. No nurse, Shota manages to croak out, wincing at how hoarse he sounds. I'm awake. Shota tries in vain to calm his raging heart, but his thoughts are still clouding his brain. He's so confused. He'd seen Oboro, and he'd seen the quirk cloud. He'd seen both, when logically he couldn't have seen either. Oboro had died. He was dead. The quirk had died along with him. Shota feels Hizashi's fingers fan out along his hip, thumb stroking slow, comforting lines along the blanket-covered skin. It does wonders to calm his heart. Not enough that he's calmed completely, but enough that the machine isn't beeping so fast or loud enough to draw in unwanted attention from medical staff. Do you know where you are, Sho? The dark-haired man ducks his head in a painful nod, grunting out his location for no other reason than to appease his husband. Hospital. Do you remember what happened? Villains, Shota forces out bluntly, voice dry and cracking. His thoughts are still running rampant in his head. He knows he should be asking about his students, about the well-being of Tsuyu, Midoriya, and Minoru, as well as all of his students who he hadn't seen since sending them off with 13. He can only hope they followed instructions better than Midoriya and the other two. He knows he should ask about them, though, make them his first concern, as their teacher, but his lagging brain is still stuck on one thing, on one person, and the question slips out past his pain medication-stalled brain to mouth filter. Where's Oboro? Where's Oboro? Hizashi's fingers still against his hip, tensing just the slightest bit before his husband forces them back into motion. It's not as smooth now, an anxious shake to his hands that Hizashi is trying to hide. Baby, Oboro is, well, what's the last thing you remember, sweetheart? At this, Shota scoffs under his bandages. I don't have brain damage or memory loss, Ashi. I know that he's... Shota sucks in a breath that tastes faintly like sterile cotton, feeling stupid for even mentioning Oboro. Of course, it had been an illusion. Oboro is dead. He'd simply been seeing things with his body and mind in such a weak, exhausted state. It's been 13 years since that villain attack. I was at the USJ with my 1A students in 13. We were supposed to be doing rescue training, but instead we were attacked by villains. It's hazy, but I remember it. That's a relief show, Hizashi mutters, fingers losing the tension and trailing up towards his stomach before drawing back and repeating the motion. Hizashi is a touchy-feely kind of person, and he is the only one that Shota will allow to touch him like this. It calms them both, simultaneously. I was warned you might have woken up confused, or even with loss of memory due to the head injury. For a second there I thought it was true. I had no idea how I would have eased into 13 years' worth of memory loss. No, Shota replies tiredly, trying and failing to lift a hand to touch his husband. He gives up trying to move, but faintly feels the soft pressure of Hizashi's other hand, settling over his bandage-covered wrist. I remember it all, and then some, I suppose. I guess I wasn't in my right mind towards the end. Is everyone all right? The students, 13? Hizashi blows out a slow breath, and Shota tenses up at the reaction. Everyone's alive, the blond man says softly, the fingers on Shota's hip slowly moving thoughtfully. You and 13 took the worst of the damage. You've been out for 2 days, and 13 has been here due to one of those villains using her own quirk against her. The students are all okay. Minor injuries mostly. Nothing more than scrapes and bruises. Midoriya had a couple broken fingers, and, well, he broke his legs using his quirk again. There was some bad bruising on his arm, but Recovery Girl took care of him. Shota's quiet for a second, just enjoying the way Hizashi's fingers trail at his side. And what's the damage? You broke both your arms in multiple places. Chiyo came after dealing with the students to speed up the process, but she only managed to mend the worst of the breaks. You were pretty exhausted by that point. You had a nasty concussion as well, hence the memory loss warning. Hizashi pauses for a second, and Shota feels his husband shifting subconsciously, like he wants to add more. What? Shota tilts his head to the side, that his hands are located, squeezing his eyes shut as he refrains from wincing at the sharp pain his movements prompt. Hizashi, too wise for his own good, spots the action easily, hand lifting off of Shota's wrist to gently cup his cheek. Try not to move around so much. Babe, you're going to be doing a lot of au naturel healing in your stamina until it builds back up. The words are accompanied by his thumb carefully stroking Shota's gauze-covered cheek before he pulls away with a tired sigh. The hand on his hip is retracted as well, but there's a weight on the bed that signifies Hizashi crossing his arms on the mattress and leaning forwards. There was some damage to your eyes, too. They're not sure if the damage will last or if it's even impacted your vision at all, but it's a possibility. Okay. The breath feels like it's knocked out of Shota's lungs as he lets Hizashi's words sink in. He'd known some of those hits had been too close to his eyes for comfort. He knows there'd been pain stinging in his eyes from concrete debris and impact, but he also knows he saw Oboro and Midoriya just fine after all that had taken place. Maybe it was a bit fuzzy, but he could still see. Anything else? Besides some sexy, badass scars? Not really. Your elbow took a hit that stumped the doctors and Chiyo. She couldn't really do much to help with it, and there's a fairly deep wound below your eye that will also scar. And of course, none of that stuff scratches the surface of the mental trauma that certainly leaves a scar. There is no mental trauma, Shota scoffs, though he's almost sure Hizashi will be booking him a therapist appointment for after he's discharged from the hospital, and he'll dutifully go, despite his protests, because the both of them preach mental health to their students when they need it, and he's not a hypocrite. I beg to differ, babe. Shota stiffly shakes his head, which prompts a screech of concern from Hizashi. Shota! Quit moving around so much, you'll hurt yourself. Shota relaxes into the pillows, silently wishing he could use his quirk on his loudly protective husband. Loud. The raven mutters helplessly as he angles his chin upwards, as if his eyes were open and uncovered. He'd be staring at the ceiling as he mulls over Hizashi's comment on his elbow. It was a quirk. I'm sorry, Sho. I bet your hand's still a bit sore. I'll try keeping it down, but I'm used to you shutting me up when I forget. Hizashi's sheepish voice goes quiet for a moment after that, before he speaks again, slow and almost confused. What was? My elbow. Shota feels tired again, like the conversation had drained what little energy he'd woken up with. The villain, the leader of the League of Villains, had a decaying quirk of some sort. I don't know how it works, but I think he has something to do with his fingers. It was only when he put all 5 on my elbow that his quirk activated. He's clever, Zashi. He figured out my quirk through observing me, fighting with the other villains he brought in. He figured out my hair was the tell that my quirk was active. The League of Villains? Hizashi's voice took a careful edge to it, and Shota could see the frown on his husband's face. I haven't heard of them before. Shota hadn't either, so he raises his shoulder in a pained shrug. They're the real deal. They broke into Yuuei during the confusion of the media getting in. They're the ones that let the media in as a distraction. They targeted us when the most of the pros would be doing a lot of work and busy sorting out that mess. They managed to get past our security measures. That's no easy feat. They're smart, a serious threat. What did they want? Hizashi asked slowly. I mean, you don't just break into such a highly secure school for shits and giggles unless you either want something or you're trying to prove something. Nezu was pretty tight-lipped about it, and to be frank, I didn't sit around long enough to chat with the students after making sure they were all right, not when you were in the state you were in. All Might. Shota breathed out a stuttered breath. They were looking for All Might. The students were just easy targets and bait. They knew he was supposed to be there with 13 and He was going to kill them, Zashi. He was going to use his decay quirk on Tsuyu, Midoriya, and Minoru while I was... They're okay, Sho. Hizashi's voice is soft and delicate, as in the way he shifts slightly before his weight disappears from the bed. There's a second where Shota panics, but it's abruptly quelled by the fact that that pressure returns. Only now Hizashi's weight is at his side, a hip pressing against Shota's own as the voice hero settles gently beside him. He feels Hizashi's arm curling around his shoulder, carefully pulling him against his side in an attempt to not irritate his injuries. Shota allows himself to be manhandled, melting back into his husband's shoulder. He resists the urge to curl completely into his husband just for the sake of his aching arms and face, letting Hizashi's soothing voice calm him instead. You kept them safe. Tsuyu told me you did. You kept them all safe. You and 13. It shouldn't have happened, Shota croaks out. His heart monitor gives a panicked string of beeps before evening out again, as Shota forces himself to calm down. They've only been at Yuuei for 2 weeks, and they've already encountered dozens of villains. That's too soon. They're too young, Zashi, too experienced right now. I know. Shota feels Hizashi's cheek press against his temple, holding him close. You can't control villain attacks, Sho. They're bound to happen in this society. The best that we can do is keep them safe, and teach them how to keep themselves and others safe in the process. And you did. They're all just fine. Shota doesn't say anything, just angles his head to tuck under Hizashi's chin. His husband lets out a fond huff as he tightens his grip perfectly so Shota feels secure, but also so his injuries aren't being aggravated. Anyways, the kids are all fine, so do me a favor, yeah? Worry about you. You look like a mummy wrapped up like that. Also, I'm a little disappointed only one of us is concerned about your well-being, and it's not you. Shota lets out a gruff huff, half-heartedly straightening up to bump the top of his head against Hizashi's chin in retaliation. It's entirely worth the sharp jolt of pain at the moment. Hey! The blonde yelps, but it's quickly overpowered by soft snorts of amused laughter at Shota's expense. He feels just faintly, Hizashi rubbing at his chin with the hand not wrapped around him, before it drops to pat Shota's head. You've got one thick head, babe. You have a bony chin, Zashi. Hey! Hizashi squawks a second time. Hizashi's feigned annoyance doesn't carry on long. It's just seconds later that the blonde-haired man is turning his own head so his cheek settles on top of Shota's. His arm has curled around him entirely now, head resting against Shota's sternum, where his finger draws lazy shapes. They settle into a comfortable silence that's only disturbed by the repetitive soft beeps of the heart monitor. It's long since steadied out, and Shota knows that it's entirely Hizashi's presence and the fact that he's tucked in so close to him. "Hey, Sho." Hizashi's voice breaks the silence. The dark-haired man gives a hum of acknowledgement, but doesn't move a muscle. "You were earlier, when you first woke up. What brought up Oboro? Why did you think he was there?" "It's stupid." The man shakes his head now, letting out a sigh. I thought I saw him there, with Midoriya. But that's impossible, because he's dead." "Sho." Hizashi sucks in a deep breath. "I know." Shota lets out a second, deeper sigh. He knows what Hizashi's thinking. The last time he'd been hell-bent on seeing Oboro had been just after that villain attack that had taken Oboro's life. He'd been so sure he'd heard Oboro's voice in the comms. He'd heard his friend promising he was okay, telling him to keep going and that he could do it, so he had. And it was only after everyone was safe and the villain apprehended that reality crashed on them. Where he'd come to realize Oboro's comm had been busted, where he'd begged and pleaded to see Oboro, who he'd been certain was still alive. This isn't like that. Shota squeezes his eyes shut tighter. It was just a illogical illusion. Maybe it was guilt, not being able to save my kids like I wasn't able to save him, or maybe it was my brain placing someone there with them who I knew would protect them even if I was unable. "You were exhausted and in pain." Hizashi's breath floods across Shota's shoulder. "That's all right, Sho. Even if it was illogical, I'm glad it's him you saw. He'd protect those kids to his last breath." The "again" was left unsaid, but heard loud and clear by Shota. "You know," Hizashi hummed softly after a second's pause, "I think he would have taken a shine to Midoriya. They kinda got the same smile, you dig? Fluorescent personalities, wild determination." Shota let out a soft laugh that comes out more like a snort. "I think you're right." Shota leans back more, now angling himself so the back of his head is supported on Hizashi's shoulder. He doesn't feel the stiffness of Hizashi's leather hero costume, so he assumes that his husband is in civilian clothes. The fatigue is catching up to him now, and by the hum his husband gives, he's sure that a new round of pain medication is being administered via IV drip. That floaty feeling is coming back. "I'm glad I got to see him again," Shota mumbles drowsily. Even if just for a second, he looks so normal, like he hadn't even aged a day, still so bright. "I wish I could have seen," Hizashi whispers in reply, letting his own head lean against Shota, cheeks settling against the raven's temple. "Feeling tired, sweetheart? You should rest up so Chiyo can use her quirk to help you healing along better. I hate seeing you like this." Shota gives a languid hum, subconsciously curling in closer. "I miss him." "Me too," Hizashi sighs, reaching up to rub at his face with the hand not around Shota. Just what, Sho?" "He wasn't there. He couldn't have been. But I saw him, and I saw the clouds, too. I can make excuses for seeing him, there's plenty, but I can't find a logical explanation for those clouds." Shota has already so far gone in the medication he doesn't feel Hizashi tense behind him. He doesn't feel his husband turn to look at him, to stare at his bandage-covered face, jaw dropping at the words. Hizashi's mouth feels dry, eyes widened as he regards his husband carefully. "Shh, just you rest now, okay? We'll talk more about it later, all right?" Another barely audible hum from Shota, followed by his breaths and the heart monitor slowly evening out. Hizashi had arrived at the USJ with the rest of the teachers. All classes had been put on lockdown, and the news that USJ was infested with villains, but not only that, but the thought that single-handedly went to Hizashi's mind was the fact that there was Shota and 1A at USJ, and that's where they'd been training. Dozens of villains against 2 pro heroes and 21st-year students who barely had 2 weeks of classes under their belts. There's a rush of available pro heroes, all of them, Ida from Shota's class tagging along with them. All Might had apparently arrived early at the USJ, and Hizashi could only hope that there were no casualties at all, students or teachers. Ida had reported dozens of criminals, speaking fast and desperately, which was different to how the young man usually talked so formally. It must be bad if it had Ida Tenya so flustered. When they arrived just a couple of minutes after All Might, it was only a few minutes, but a lot can happen in just a couple minutes when it comes to villain fights. So everyone got to work. Snipe took out the bigger threats with his precision shots, while Hizashi himself cleared the stairs leading to the exit with his quirk, easily overpowering the horde of villains who were slowly trekking up to get to his students. He'd seen Shota out of the corner of his eye, draped over Shoji's back and shoulders, hanging lifelessly. The panic of seeing him like that had his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew he had to keep himself together. Not only did the students not know the two of them were married, but he'd also like to not show any sort of affection that could negatively affect either his own or Shota's hero work when there were so many villains around. Besides, the students would be more panicked if his husband was dead. He was just badly hurt, so that's what he kept telling himself, at least. Still, he's not sure he'll be able to forget how still and bloody Shota is on Shoji's back. It's something out of his own personal nightmares. He was badly injured. That's all Hizashi could see every time that he snuck a glance over his shoulder or let his eyes linger too long. He wanted nothing more than to sprint to Shota's side and take him into his arms. But he can't yet. He has to make sure the students are all right. He has to help with the cleanup here. Shota was alive. He was alive and currently in an ambulance on the way to the hospital for help. And if anything did happen to Shota, he'd be called, considering he was Shota's healthcare proxy. So, until he got that call, he'd do damage control with the other teachers, until he could manage to slip away to be with his husband. If he doesn't take too long to neutralize all the villains. All Might had appeared to be in a heated battle with one of the main villains when they'd arrived, and Hizashi had only a second where his heart had dropped into his stomach at seeing Midoriya, Bakugo, Kirishima, and Todoroki right there in the fight with him. He had to trust All Might not to let any of the kids be harmed. The villain All Might is facing off against gets shot by Snipe a couple of times before he can get his hands on any of the kids. He'd been trying to reach Midoriya, but thankfully was rerouted by the shot. 13, injured, but still fighting, tries to capture the two villains in her quirk, but they manage to warp outside of the USJ before either can be apprehended, or caught in the black hole quirk. Hizashi has a sneaking suspicion that that's how all of these villains got in the first place. After securing the place, Detective Naomasa and officers arrive in, and the students are escorted out of the building. And now that the threat's gone too, 13 is loaded into an ambulance and sent to the hospital. Hizashi doesn't see Midoriya or All Might after the event. He'd just barely seen Cementos wall off the number one hero and the student he'd been taking a liking to. He'd definitely overdone it, no doubt in his weak form after all that. Hisashi's just glad that he'd managed to keep it up for the whole fight. The blonde watches half-heartedly as a huge creature thing is collected and cuffed, securely cuffed and loaded into a secure, quirk-canceling SWAT truck. It doesn't speak or do anything other than move as directed. Hizashi shuffles his cell phone from his pocket to see if he's got a call from the hospital, but there's nothing yet, so he'll check in with some of the students. Bakugo, Kirishima, and Todoroki are all stood together, frowns on their faces. "Okay, listeners." Hizashi cocks his head. "No injuries, you three are all okay?" "We're okay," Todoroki answers with a light frown. "We're good," Kirishima agrees before biting his lip. "I don't know about Midoriya, though. I went to see if he was okay, but Cementos wouldn't let me." "Midoriya's fine," Hizashi promises, but he hadn't heard anything about the students with severe injuries. "He's with All Might. I think they're going to see Recover Girl, so I'm sure you three can see him after the detectives finish with everyone's statements." "I don't want to see that stupid Deku," Bakugo hisses, turning his back to the group but not moving away. Hizashi just arches an eyebrow at his back before looking at Todoroki and Kirishima. "Well," the voice hero clears his throat, giving the other two a small smile. "If you boys did, then that's where he'd be. Give him a bit of a breather first, you dig?" "Totally," Kirishima grins. Pleased with that, Hizashi makes his rounds through the 1A class. He makes a mental list of kids that he's going to recommend to Hound Dog to check in throughout the next couple of weeks. In a perfect world, they'd all go see him, but for now he's pinpointing the ones who look the most shaken from the incident. The last two students to check in with are Suyu and Mineta, who'd been talking with the detective for a while. He'd passed by them twice already, but they just seem to be finishing up their statements. So the voice hero makes a beeline for them. Listeners, I've been waiting to check in with you two. Have you been giving your statements this whole time? We have, Ribbit. Suyu nodded solemnly. That was so crazy, Mineta exclaims, looking at him with awe. We almost died. And that, well, that's not something anyone wants to hear from a teenager's mouth. Hizashi forces his expression to stay neutral, schooling his features. He tries to think of a way to respond to that. I'm sorry. No. That's cool. Definitely no. Instead, he blanks in surprise before forcing out his words. I understand this was a very traumatic incident. Hound Dog, our school guidance counselor, will be checking in on you guys over the next few days, but please, if you have concerns or need to seek him out, do so. Even another teacher or a guardian. It was scary, Ribbit, Suyu tells him with a frown. I'm sorry to hear that, listener, Hizashi tells her honestly. Scary, Mineta whines. That was terrifying. We'd be toast if it weren't for Sensei and Midoriya. You were with Midoriya and Eraserhead. Hizashi tried hard to school his surprise. Suyu nods. They saved me. A villain tried to use his quirk on me, but Sensei erased his quirk before he could. And then Midoriya turns around and tried to punch him, Mineta continues loudly. Suyu regards the short boy before turning and looking back at Hizashi. He did, Ribbit, but he ended up punching that monster thing the police found. But it didn't really work. It was strong. I thought we were goners. Mineta's face drops into an expression of sheer fear. It grabbed Midoriya and went to squash him like it did to Sensei, but then there these clouds just up and appeared out of nowhere. Clouds out of nowhere? In a closed building. Clouds? Hizashi prompts after a second of thought. Hizashi looked back towards the USJ as if he'd suddenly noticed these clouds the students were talking about. He'd been in there earlier and hadn't seen any. Weird, right? They filed in so fast we couldn't even see each other, and then they were just lifting us up and carrying us away. Just us two, though. I don't know what happened to Midoriya. There was even a cloud hiding Sensei from the villains. Ribbit, Suyu nodded. It's true, but they disappeared suddenly and we fell a little bit. All the clouds disappeared at once. We think it was a villain who rescued us. A villain? Hizashi turned to look at them with a raised eyebrow. A villain rescued you guys? The two students shrugged. We know everyone in our class's quirks, Suyu reminds with a frown, so it wasn't any of us, and it wasn't Sensei or 13, that just leaves the villains. As true as that was, Hizashi couldn't see it. A villain going against the plan and saving Hero Corps students, the chances of that happening are in the negatives. There's not a lot of suitable explanations for the clouds, but a villain going rogue in the middle of an attack? Nearly impossible. Plus, a quirk like that would have been documented. And you two told the detective all this? Sure did, Mineta grins. Too cool not to share. Those clouds were so cool, and how they just dispersed and disappeared, too. It almost makes up for the fact that we almost died. Almost. That still sucked. Hizashi eyes the kid for a second, only to jolt as his phone buzzes in his pocket. His heart hammers in his chest as he's reminded of his husband's condition. The blonde-haired man forces a smile at the two teens before taking a step back and sliding his phone out of his pocket. Excuse me, listeners, I gotta take this. With a wave thrown over his shoulder, he answers the call and makes his way towards the school, where he'll pick up the car and make his way over to the hospital after stopping at home to change into his civilian clothes. Last thing he needs is to be hassled by present Mike fans when all he wants to do is be with his injured husband. Hizashi spends the whole drive home and to the hospital, with his thoughts teetering between Shota and the mysterious clouds that the students had witnessed. This concludes Chapter 6 of Yuuei Survival Guide. I'll be back with the newest chapter update here as soon as possible. Hope you guys are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.